Welcome. My name is Reverend Jude Geiger. This is Roots to Leaves. I serve community church in New York City, and I'm joined today with our chaplain for pastoral care, Brother Zachary, and our student minister, Dr. Yvonne Garrett. And this season, we're looking at our values as articulated through a recent passage, justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, generosity. And today, we're looking specifically at the interplay between justice as a value and generosity as a value, and maybe the two as a covenant as well. We're going to begin today with Brother Zachary. He had some thoughts about generosity that I think we can begin with.
Thank you. Thank you, Jude. Yes, I am particularly interested in this word generosity because while on the one hand, justice is so frequently brought into our conversations about the world and what's taking place, what does justice look like? How do we practice justice with integrity and intention? I think there's a little bit less attention placed on generosity. I find that we maybe assume generosity, we take it for granted, we assume we know what it means. But what does it actually look like to be generous with our time? I think in the covenant, we claim to be generous with our faith, with our presence, and with our resources. What does generosity actually look like? And part of our conversation before this episode centered on generosity as somewhat of a smokescreen for capitalism. We hide behind how generosity and philanthropy can explain away or excuse some of the ills of capitalism. Isn't it so good that we are able to give so much money while simultaneously ignoring some of the harms?
Oddly, this came up Tuesday night in a presentation I was doing for my doctoral class on political theology with a bunch of other doctoral students. And it was about Emily Towns in her book, Cultural Production of Evil, is sort of doing an analysis of Max Weber's read on Calvin. Okay, those are a bunch of people. Emily Towns is a contemporary theoethicist, womanist scholar. Max Weber was looking at how economics influences social order, but from an idea that there's some kind of inherent theological reality to economics. Towns was particularly critiquing Weber's use of Calvin in this with the idea of like what I would call the cult of the Protestant work ethic, right?
Yeah.
If we're good with this, but it's true. Originally in Calvinism, there's an idea that your prosperity is a marker of God's grace. But what Calvin was doing in this was on top of creating the Protestant work ethic. Essentially, he was also saying, though, but as a marker of your God's good graces, you'll be generous with people. And that sort of gets lost in the modern Christian nationalist adaptation.
Reverend Jude, a lot of what you shared to me is also just so rooted in our moment. I'm noticing how so much of what it is that we're dealing with right now in our religious institutions and in our country really is the heritage of so much of the ideas, Reverend Jude, that you're talking about. Unchecked capitalist work ethic transformed into some sort of nationalist identity. That's so much, and it's seeped into religious communities of all kinds. It would be completely dishonest and untrue to say that the capitalist work ethic is a Protestant problem alone.
It's almost, and again, I want to think about something that was lifted up in our pre-production conversation, and it's the Cornell West quote that, Zachary, that you brought up, which is, justice is what love looks like in public. And I would also argue, I am one, should come as no surprise, who always votes for reclaiming language. In other words, the Protestant work ethic folks, the unchecked capitalism folks, don't get to own the word generous. They don't get to be the only people who get to define what generosity is. And looking at generosity as a covenant, the words are, we covenant to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Our generosity connects us to one another in relationships of interdependence and mutuality. Now, that word resources often means money in capitalist societies. But for people like me who don't have financial wealth, I do have love. I have a big heart. And often our time, and I'm talking about the three of us, but also other people who are on the ministry path or already serving as ministers and chaplains, etc., doing justice work, our time is a resource. And we often can't choose, because we do live under capitalism, where we spend that time, but we can also choose, there's a space here we can serve, there's a space there we can serve. And when I think about my faith, my humanism, it's driven by both a need to do everything that I can with my resources, with my generosity, if you will, to help the path of justice move forward in the world. I teach on Wednesday nights, and it was something I was saying to my students last night, a couple of whom were feeling a little, I think what a lot of us are feeling pre-election. What can we do? There's a huge issue. Or when you're working with, any of climate justice or housing justice, voting justice, labor justice, it feels huge. It feels like this huge system is just pressing down and there's nothing we can do. And I think about tiny doable things that I can do every day. I don't feel that I have a huge amount to give all of the time, but what I can do is I can listen and I can show that I care. I can go out into the world. On my lunch break today, I know there's a guy who lives in front of the Rite Aid, and rather than going to the CVS, I'm going to go to the Rite Aid, see how he's doing, and have that conversation. And that's a choice of time, which is a resource, of myself, of my listening, which is a resource, and of my love. And I would say that justice is what love looks like in public. This specific, maybe I'll call it UU generosity or faith-based generosity, is also what love can look like in public. So maybe that's how I'm trying to reposition that word away from the kind of, I think what we're often, particularly this time of year when many of us get those mailers, give money to this cause, give money to that cause, give money to the other cause. And if you add it all up, particularly the ones who have minimums of $25 or $35, it's not something I can do. But there are other things I can do. I can march, I can vote, I can phone bank, I can care, I can show up to a rally, I can do other things with my time and myself and my attention.
I hear that. I hear you repositioning generosity in thinking about it as a spiritual discipline that is not necessarily dependent on being rich already. You can be generous even if you are not deep pocketed. And I do really resonate with that understanding of generosity. It seems connected in particular to this giving of the self, giving of the presence. It feels very Franciscan to me as well. We use a word often in my communities, the word service, that I notice has a different connotation outside of our community. We don't like to talk about serving each other or being in service or of service. And in fact, I do think there's a way that we can heal a bit from the generational trauma of forced servitude, the ways that we serve one another against our will. But that's a different question. I don't want to get too far away from the question of generosity because what you brought up, Yvonne, this question of being generous, I also want to point to the ways that we often use the term to abuse those who are poor. And, we talk about this personal risk associated with acting in accordance with justice. Oftentimes, folks will give their last financial resources to a cause and really are unable to support themselves. We lift up that generosity as an act of self-sacrifice. And I'm certainly not saying that we shouldn't be risky with our faith. But there's an added element. We have to be able to live our lives if we're going to be generous at all. We can't get in our own way and become a martyr, giving away resources we don't actually have. I think I'm the first one to admit that I'm guilty of giving away time that I don't actually have, time that needs to be spent healing, resting, caring for myself, caring for the sort of quotidian, mundane aspects of daily life. It's so easy for me to give that away as if I'm being generous, to spend time listening and being attentive to those closest to me and feel, high and mighty for my gift, when in fact that's misusing my resources. I wasn't a good listener because I was distracted by what needed to happen instead. We have to be aware that generosity doesn't mean giving away resources we don't actually have.
Yeah, and the idea of being generous with oneself as well. I think there's that misused term self-care that can be really feed into individualism, and often what I see is yet another part of the capitalist system, go and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on self-care. But yeah, it is hard to be generous with others. It sounds a little trite, but if we're not generous with ourselves as well. And that's something we were talking about earlier, a question that comes up for me, and I'm sure for you all as well, is how do you find the energy? How do you find the time? When do you sleep? It's a constant conversation and that I have. And I also want to harken back, and I know it's not necessarily completely on topic, but the comment you made about service and being in service, and to minister to means to serve. But it's something that, as a feminist and a labor justice person, I'm often like, well, wait a minute, to serve how much, and who am I serving? If I'm serving people in positions of extreme privilege, is that really what I need to be doing here? I would love to hear from you, Jude, about, do you see justice and generosity as working together, or do you see them as inherently, under a capitalist system, being in conflict almost?
Personally, I am very curious if you have examples, Reverend Jude or Yvonne, if you have examples of a time that this was hard, when generosity was weird, or generosity didn't feel just, or even in the reverse, when trying to do justice felt like withholding generosity or something.
So generosity as a value is what we would call contingent on our other set of values and norms, right? What I think is generous is not going to be the same as somebody else. And I think that there's a whole lot of weirdness in Western society, certainly in the States, around entitlement versus feeling entitled to. Like, what are you actually entitled to versus what do we feel? And each of our particular locations, social locations, is going to really change how we interact with somebody. So, whether it is, I'm going to rely on Emily Towns again. She talks a lot about narrative tropes, and she looks at stereotypes and cultural icons that tie into service, right? The nanny, or there are others that would relate to this, but for someone of African American descent serving someone who's affluent, if the person doesn't come from that class background themselves, has a whole narrative in U.S. history that was specifically utilized to reinforce the very notion of hierarchies in capitalism. And so you got to be careful with that. Or the other extreme, gay male sex workers working with Republican senators or congressmen who are voting against them. That's an extreme, but that's happening too. And the right will create narratives and stories and tropes around gay men to solidify heteronormative things, right? So I really appreciate the question of what does generous mean, because it's going to mean different things to all of us, and it's got to always be in relation to the values of the people around us. in the communities around us.
I couldn't agree more, Jude. That was a very clear introduction, at least for me, to some of the issues that I have as a man of color, as a person of color, trying to engage this question of service. I do love the way that I can show love in clear ways, and I think the discipline that attempting to show and demonstrate acts of service can offer me are truly good for my soul. It gets complicated, however, when I am serving white individuals or white contexts. When I find myself as the only person of color in the room, I notice the way that I respond to the question of service is so much contextualized. My racialized identity, as well as the way that just the harms of racism that I inherit, they bring this shroud where my service doesn't appear as generosity; it appears as subjugation. I feel robbed of my opportunity to be generous because of the assumption, the entitlement that goes along with the assumption that I belong in a role of service, and that's an assumption I think I don't need anyone else in the room to hold. You know, we fall off the question of racism thinking, well, I'm not that racist person. Brother Zachary, I don't think you belong in service. And we forget the way that that narrative is written into our interactions. Mm-hmm. It's not about what you believe. It's about how our world interprets where we belong.
Sure. I find that incredibly helpful, and I'm thinking about sort of gender-based assumptions too. I think you and I talk about these things quite a bit, of service, and thinking about some of our congregations where it's an assumption that the women, particularly older women, will take care of the coffee. They'll take care of, the hospitality. They'll take care of the circle dinners. And sometimes those are the folks who step up to do the volunteering, to do the service. I also think about, workspaces I've been in where the women, and often BIPOC women, who are in roles that are subordinate to, say, tenured faculty or what have you, there's just an assumption that they will do whatever. They'll fix the copier, they'll order the pizza, they'll do things that have nothing whatsoever to do with their job description. And yet, because they are the female in the room of a certain status, lower status than others on the job ladder, that they'll take care of all the things that nobody else wants to do, And I think that, often we are expected, by we, I mean, those who are of a gender are expected, or of, our BIPOC folks as well, are expected to step up and do the work, often without additional remuneration or even thanks. And it's just, well, they're really kind. They really go the extra mile. And again, there's the statements that many of us, including me, have heard. Well, I don't see you that way. I don't see you as subordinate. But can you order the pizza? And that's kind of almost a nitpicky thing, but it's the way that capitalism makes us look at service and generosity.
That is enough about generosity tied to money and labor and economics. What about generosity of spirit?
Mm-hmm.
What about Unitarian Universalist evangelical fervor? Oh, we've all recoiled somewhere.
No, not at all. Absolutely not. Because I think that's what I was referencing when I talk about going out into the streets. That is evangelical for me. That's where I find that space. And when people ask me, which church do you serve? Because people do ask that. I have one guy who's convinced that I must be working at the Protestant church on the corner. He said, because the way you speak, the way that you listen, the way you approach me, and he has called me generous, how generous you are. That to me is deeply informed by my passion for my faith and my belief that is supported in and of and has grown within the community that is Unitarian Universalism. I mean, you can hear it in my voice. I get started talking about UU. I'm not going to shut up. So I'm going to pass it on to back to you, Jude, or to Brother Zach.
I love where this conversation has gone, and I'm thinking about the generosity of love and spirit as a guidepost for how we might rethink generosity. And I think that's what the values seem to be trying to encourage us to do anyway. I love the use of the word evangelical, although I'm suspicious that the three of us might have different meanings for this word. And I'm curious what generosity of spirit can look like in a UU context. And I think one of the benefits of this podcast is we can often look to similarities in the way that each of us approach the world and approach our faith to come to shared understanding. I'm a little more interested in our differences because I think we all share an understanding of love and its transformative power. But what does generosity of spirit look like, and how could it look different in the three of us, I guess, is my question. That feels like a very rich question, and I'm curious how you both answer it, and I'm happy to answer it first, because to me it's deeply connected to this question of service. I mentioned that I feel robbed of my opportunity to be generous in those spaces where my service is expected or assumed. And I think that reconnecting to my power and my agency often looks like remembering that the relationship that I have to the divine, my journey, my growth, my patterns, my expressions of faith have very little to do with what a given social interaction looks like on the outside. So acknowledging, being aware of the legacies of racism that allow me to live out roles of service and allow others, frankly, to accept and receive my service very comfortably, that might be an ugly process. And yet the opportunity that I have to grow in love and to show others love is not diminished by that legacy of trauma. So that's, to me, a generosity of spirit and generosity of love looks like being myself, even when it looks and feels weird, to trust that I have my own best interest at heart. There's a responsibility that I have my own best interest at heart, but I think the trusting is what love looks like for me in public. What about y'all?
I'm thinking about something that came up with the climate revival movement this fall that I believe came out of it, that popped up in a few other places. This kind of mindset of us as facilitators will be modeling imperfections so that you as participants can model grace. And I read it in the material and I thought that was sweet. And then I heard it at another conference and it hit me as a little bit more than sweet. It hit me as, right, yeah, that's what we should be doing as participants. We should be modeling grace, which is an act of generosity, right? And then I think it got woven into the Mosaic conference down in Maryland. I don't know if it was said explicitly, but I felt it. And it sort of seeped in. It's like, yeah, let's just be generous with each other, with our patience, not quite going to the spot of creating that runaway train story with everyone's lives that we just ran into for 4 seconds that we carry with us for the rest of the day, and just make it easier for everybody. It doesn't cost us to go back to capitalism. It doesn't cost us anything to be that kind of generous.
I feel like I'm sort of torn in two different directions. One, in response to Zachary and what you were saying. And yes, our faith does show up differently. I'm always excited by the similarities, you know that, because we do hold very, very different faiths. Mine is not based on a belief in a divine. And that can get very lonely sometimes because there isn't that, well, but there's another well that I draw on. And I think, Jude, that you're referencing that when you talk about modeling grace. It's the ability to, and always a growing edge, as they say in seminary, for me to stop and listen and understand what it is that feels like someone's poking me and I need to respond, rather than responding, to stop and listen both to myself and to that person with a certain level of generosity. And I'm not saying expose ourselves to harm at all, but I think I've seen it in various of the UU congregations where I've, there's that word, served, but participated in community, I'll say it that way, where people sometimes feel unheard to the extent where they need to express themselves, even if they're like, what did you say, runaway train or freight train over
Runaway train,
over the other person without hearing what the other person is saying. Almost if the only way some folks have learned to be in community is to be in argument. And it's almost like they enjoy that argument. And it doesn't feel, trying to work with the language here, either just or generous to either the person, fomenting the argument or the person responding to the argument. And, how are we generous with ourselves in that space, but leading other folks or encouraging other folks into generosity with each other? How do you build beloved community if we don't love each other? Maybe that's a question also for the larger country that is really hard to focus on.
Well, and it's a central precept in the Wellspring curricula, where listening to each other is a spiritual practice. And for folks that are not familiar with Wellspring, who are listening to this separately, it's a small group ministry where in between each sharing, there's an invitation for folks to literally or figuratively take 3 long breaths before responding. And the mindset is just, we can be generous with our presence to each other and not be thinking about the next thing. And in life, when we're not in small groups and we're going about our days to CVS and on the streets and whatnot, we're not generous. We are thinking about the next thing by default. And that's survival in some ways, very real. And generosity then becomes countercultural. And countercultural doesn't always mean safe.
I think that's some of the risk that we're talking about, some of the personal risks associated with trying to live out our values. I'm feeling particularly moved. I don't know why it feels like such an aha moment, but Jude, I think your words were, let's make things easier for each other. And I haven't quite gotten past it. Yvonne, what you shared was very clear and insightful as well. And it seems to me almost an expression of that idea. Jude, I want to say that is the how. How is it that we make justice generous? How is it that we perform generosity as an act of justice? I think it's by making things easier for each other, and giving ourselves the grace of knowing that sometimes our best efforts to make things easier for someone else will fail. We don't know what's best for others. We rarely even know what's best for ourselves sometimes. However, our faith does compel us to just make life a little bit easier for each other. I think we deserve that in our beloved communities.
And with that good word, it has been great to be with you all today. Thanks for joining us on another session of Roots to Leaves. I'm Reverend Jude Geiger, joined with Brother Zachary and Dr. Yvonne Garrett. See you next time.